Good evening, everyone, once again. Thank you for joining us for this webinar. It is the first webinar of Dawra Madwarna's second series. We had a series last year where we had 3 webinars, and we would like to replicate the model this year, having another 3 webinars over the course of this season. As always, we are Dawra Madwarna, so we will be dealing with networks of green open space, but we always tackle slightly different topics each time. So just to get this webinar started, today we're going to focus on the need for locality-based plans, and in fact our panelists reflect this. They all work in the field of locality-based planning, decision support for such planning, and so on and so forth, as they will explain. So let us get this webinar started. Now, I'd just like to explain, as you know, this webinar is being recorded, and after an hour or so of panel discussion, in which you are invited to type your questions in the chat box, which we will be monitoring, we will open up the floor to all our participants, and we'll remove the spotlighting function of the panelists so that we can have a group discussion. So let us get started with a round of introductions, and then we'll start off the debate. Just before that, Heather McNamara is my co-moderator today, and Heather is a research support officer on the Heidi project at the university. And Heidi, for those of you who are not familiar with the project, deals with community-driven digital action and how we can drive social change post-pandemic using digital support systems. So this webinar is a joint collaboration between Dawra Madwarna and bringing in also the Heidi project. So thank you, Heather, for your help throughout these past few weeks. Now, let's start off with the round of introductions that I mentioned before. Sarah's the first one on my screen, so would you like to start off?
Okay. Hi. So, good evening, everyone. For those who don't know me, my name is Sarah Scheiber. I'm one of the co-founders of Dawra Madwarna, and I'm also an academic at the University of Malta within the Faculty for the Built Environment. And my own research focuses on the planning and design of urban open spaces and the concept of green infrastructure. And that's why I'm participating in the panel discussion today. I'll stop there for now.
Yes, we'll have time to elaborate on each of your different streams of work. Mario. Mario, we cannot hear you.
Hi, good evening to everyone. My name is Mario Fava. I'm the president of the Local Councils Association in Malta. And the role of the association is to ensure effective collaboration and consultation and coordination in all directions and at all levels, possibly.
Thank you. We'll definitely have some questions for you in a few moments. Antoine, would you like to say a few words?
Yes, hi, good evening to everyone. I'm Antoine Zammit. I'm a senior lecturer at university. My specialization is urban design, but I also interface with urban governance and spatial planning. And I'm also the founder and director of local practice StudjUrban, which focuses on architectural and urban design in particular.
Thank you. Steve?
Hello, my name is Steve Zammit. I'm 27 years old. I'm a local councillor in my hometown of Zammit. I'm very interested in environmental issues and also urban planning and issues about mobility.
And to round up our list of panelists, Carlos?
Hello, everyone. I'm Carlos. I'm a PhD student at the Institute for Climate Change and Sustainable Development at the University of Malta. I created Walk in Malta as part of my PhD, which is a community research project that allows everyday pedestrians to share their walking experiences and also identify which elements of the public space influence such experiences, both in a positive and negative way.
So thank you, everyone. These are our lovely participants this evening. And maybe I can start off with a very general question, that's just to kickstart the discussion. And I'm going to ask Sarah. Sarah and I are colleagues, for those of you who don't know, and obviously we discussed this webinar together, came up with the concept together. So let's start with a general overview of locality-based planning. And Sarah, how you feel that we can move towards having better networks of green open space through this specific planning tool.
Okay, I mean, obviously there are different aspects to locality-based planning. I guess from my perspective, the focus or the area that I would mention, as I was saying, my research was on the planning and design of urban open spaces, and one of the aspects which emerged through the research and through the literature is this idea of having a network of green open spaces, right? As one of the important principles of planning for open spaces, if we really want to maximize the potential benefits of having open spaces in urban areas in order to contribute to social, environmental, and economic aspects. Now, as Dawra Madwarna, we then continued on this and we wrote a position paper about networks of green open spaces to create more awareness and try and drive and push this idea forward. But it doesn't work in isolation, basically. There are a number of different layers as part of planning, as part of the concept of urban design, which one needs to take into account. And this is why there are even so many participants over here to discuss this topic. But one of the things that I wanted to bring to the discussion is as well that, for example, through the EU biodiversity strategy, this calls upon cities with over 20,000 inhabitants to develop what they call urban greening plans by 2021. So I think that's one interesting aspect for me in the sense of how do we apply that in the local context, right? Do we look at our regions? Do we look at our localities? We have localities which are over 20,000 in terms of population, but obviously they do not work in isolation. So one of the things, you know, which I want to discuss is how do we do this locally, and how do the different aspects as well come together in an integrated way, and in what we are calling here locality-based integrated planning. So I think I can stop here for now.
We'll pick this up later. But one thing that comes out from what you've said, I think I'd like to ask Mario, as president of the LCA, how do you see your role being able to play out as LCA in terms of this kind of locality-based planning? So as we know, the planning system in Malta is very centralized at the planning authority, and the local councils do not have any planning powers. So how do you see the local councils being able to operate a certain level of locality-based planning? You are muted.
Being the closest authority to the residents, all local and regional councils should be involved in a bottom-up approach, you know, decision-making in our localities. And in this regard, the LCA launched its vision in October 2019, and we launched this vision because we wanted to be proactive and also to have a shared vision for all regional and local authorities in Malta. The vision was developed on 4 main pillars, which are sustainable mobility, urban green open spaces, and smart cities. And each and every one of these 4 pillars obviously include several other elements, such as shared transport, EV infrastructure, last mile transportation, park and gardens, clean air, alternative energy, and so on. Obviously, this is an ambitious plan, and it should be strengthened by political will at all levels. And having all regional and local councils pulling the same rope in the same direction, I think it's the right strategy for us to be able to implement and change the mindset of the Maltese culture in this regard. Because, as you know, when we try to implement drastic changes, most of the time, the first reaction would be negative. But then if you take time and explain the reason for such changes, people are starting to accept more and being more receptive to such changes. So I believe that as local and regional authorities, being the closest authority to the residents, we can be part, and we will definitely be part of this change. And I believe that that's in the long run, people will understand this needs to happen, as Sarah said before.
And maybe just to bring in different people, just to kickstart the discussion over here. So Antoine, I know that you authored the document Slow Streets, no, for the Local Council Association. I don't know if you want to say a few words on your experience authoring this document, since it was a form of this kind of planning that we would like to see more of, as Mario was saying.
Yeah, sure. The Slow Streets was maybe one of the first more tangible, let's say, outcomes that were developed even from what Mario mentioned before, the residents first strategy. So one of the pillars is, in fact, sustainable mobility. We understand that there is a strong interrelationship and a strong interface between mobility and open space. And therefore, we sought to try and understand how we could improve the safety and also the experience of being within the local street environment. There are many layers, many interfaces of open spaces. Of course, there are the small urban pockets, there are the piazzas, there are the formal green areas and the informal green areas. There's also the street network. And we wish to emphasize that. I mean, the local streets, in a number of cases, we did strategies for 43 local councils in the end out of 68. And we were seeing recurring problems. For example, how local streets are used as channels to race through rather than vehicles using the main infrastructure, the arterial and distributor road infrastructure. And we wish to address that. Conflicts between pedestrians and vehicles. So unsafe areas, areas which are unclear because they are not well defined, a lot of leftover space, and so on and so forth. And therefore, we wish to understand how we could slow down. That's the idea of slow streets. In fact, slowing down vehicular speeds within our local streets, in order to, particularly for the more vulnerable street users, them being mostly children and elderly, of course, all levels of users, but particularly the vulnerable ones, to have a better experience overall, but also, of course, to address the safety issues. The experience has been varied, has been very interesting. With some local councils, we are in fact developing further now and following up and starting to implement some projects. Of course, it's not always the same story throughout. I mean, with some councils, it might be harder. However, there were a number of councils that had already started to preempt this rationale, this mentality, even before we started working on slow streets. So of course there are different experiences that maybe we can even discuss throughout the webinar, but certainly it is this, together with maybe another project that maybe even Mario can elaborate more, which is the documents that we are developing on a number of themes within these 4 pillars of the Residents First strategy. And in the end, I think we'll have around 24 documents that aim to also empower local councils about certain subject matters and certain standards and so on and so forth.
Yes, and in fact, we put the link in the chat. Heather has put the link in the chat to the website of the Local Council Association, where you can find the Residents First strategy that has been mentioned. So at this point, maybe I can bring in Steve. Steve, as a local councillor and as someone who works very, very, very hard within the locality and whose work is very tangible in this respect, could you share your experiences so far in this bottom-up kind of more community-based initiative that you've been trying to really spearhead?
Well, hello everyone. Thanks for the opportunity. I think, as Mario said before, while there are lots of challenges and sometimes you do feel some resistance, especially when you bring on ideas that are not really accustomed yet in Malta. But I think the awareness is increasing. I think residents also the fact that it's in other countries too. So for example, in our locality, we had kicked off the idea that on public holidays or on eves of public holidays, depending on when the day in the week comes, we pedestrianize the public piazza in the center of the village, so kids can come out to play, people can socialize, families can come have a drink, have a pizza, and the kids are running around. So it's a very safe environment. Of course, at first you do find some resistance, even from the shop owners who obviously have a commercial priority first. But once you try to communicate with everyone and they can see that there is tangible difference and things can be better, people do come on board and they start to ask you when you're going to do the next one, or can't we start doing this more often, not only on public holidays. Obviously, I would want that we do it more, and I have also the backing of the whole council on this, which is very, very positive. But then obviously there are challenges that as a local council, we wish to do more, but we do not have the human resources to do them or the financial constraints to do them. So that's obviously something that, you know, the country has to decide in which direction we wish to go in.
Yes, well, the allocation of resources is something that we discuss very much as planners. And also, this is always, I see Mario nodding, this is always something which is at the forefront, which is the priority, and therefore where you allocate resources. But to keep the discussion on this kind of bottom-up community initiative, Carlos, maybe you could explain your work, which you have done, and which you mentioned very briefly in your introduction, in the walkability app that you have created, so that we can start to understand how citizen science can be a push towards more community-driven initiatives.
Sure. If you don't mind, I'm going to share the screen. So I'll show you a couple of slides. It's going to be much easier for everyone to understand the project. Can you see it?
Yes.
So, well, just to make a very long story short, I just developed a methodology where pedestrians can use WhatsApp to share the walking experience with me, with their research. So they need to follow these 4 steps. Just take a picture of the place, rate their walk with specific variables. So in this case, comfortable and pleasant. Then they need to say what makes them feel that way. So here's where the built environment and the walkable environment comes. So in this case, we can see that the person said that white pavements, palm trees, and so on. And finally, they need to share the location. WhatsApp also gave me the date and the time of the observation. So after analyzing and processing this data, I came up with 2 main research outputs. The first one, I'm not sure if you can see the table, but I just wanted to show how many determinants came up from the research. Bear in mind that this is a bottom-up approach. So I didn't tell pedestrians what to observe. I just let them tell me what was relevant for them. And I received over 100 different things that, according to pedestrians, influenced their experience. So then I categorized them. And if you want, later on, we can see some of the most cited categories and subcategories, because each one would have a particular policy or planning strategy. And then the second research output would be the spatial distribution and the degree of perceived walkability. So I aggregated these observations and calculated which areas are perceived as more pedestrian friendly and which areas are perceived as less pedestrian friendly. And because pedestrians collect this information simultaneously, I can do some data analysis and see which specific characteristics and elements of the public space are linked to specific experiences. So in this case here, we can see that for unsafe experiences, the most relevant determinants were pavement surface, absence of pavement, but also exposure to traffic, permanent and temporary barriers. Once again, it's important to tell the difference between different barriers because they will need different policies and interventions. And yeah, basically, these are the main two research outputs that I wanted to show. Obviously, this could be a very good policy tool to prioritize interventions. And there are many other things about the research, but I think that I will leave it here. And then people can ask later on if they want to know something else. I'm gonna leave this here just to give the idea that the whole idea of the research is to create a feedback loop where community researchers and policymakers contribute, but also benefit from the whole framework. So
thank you, Carlos. Yes, in fact, Heather has put the link to your website and in the chat, and people can access it. We hope also as Dawra Madwarna to have a chance to use this app in an event we are organizing in Senglia at the end of October for European Local Democracy Week, where we would like to use these kind of digital support tools and even others that we have come across.
In just the last thing, in this case, what I was looking in the research is to find an alternative for a walkability app. Later on, if you want, I can show you different existing apps and existing platforms, open source platforms that you can use. But in this case, I wanted to use an app or something that was already there, people were familiar with. And we tested social media platforms like Facebook, Twitter, and so on, and also messaging platforms like WhatsApp. And then we saw that WhatsApp was the most suitable technology for this kind of research. But it's not an app. It's a whole framework.
It's a framework. It's a framework. Yes, it's a framework for gathering bottom-up data. No, using the concept of citizen science. So using people as scientists. One thing that I would like to now ask to anyone who would like to take this up is, how do you see this kind of citizen science, these kind of frameworks, digital frameworks, there are digital support systems being used within policy making or at a general level in Malta? Do you see a future for that? I don't know who is interested in considering this. Sarah.
Okay. Yes, I mean, very briefly, really. I just wanted to bring to the table that sort of this idea of walkability and this idea of gathering data. One relates to the use of these digital applications, and they can be sort of one source of information. But with the idea of integrated planning, there would be many sources of information. So whether it's the bottom up, and whether it's like walkability, or whether it's studies like it's happening with slow streets. With the idea of networks of green open space, you know, there are other layers like thinking about traffic management, thinking about parking, thinking about vegetation or water aspects. One of the benefits is, you know, trying to mitigate flooding. So to me, it's also about how do all these studies come together and who carries out the studies. So who carries out the studies and at what level? So as I was saying, with the locality level. And how are they funded, really? So Steve was mentioning, you know, the projects, right? So doing this project, starting with the pedestrianization of spaces temporarily, and that's one way of sort of creating demand, in the sense that, you know, you start to have these projects, people start to like it, and people want to start to have more. But then you need to start deciding sort of, okay, which projects, what comes first? How do you prioritize, and how do they fit together? And that's where these kind of, well, from the citizens, from the social science part and the citizen science part, what do they prioritize, but also what do other technical studies do, and how do these come together? But that also requires a certain level of, well, funding for these kind of studies, and integrating them with planning in the planning system as well. So yes, in answer to your question, I definitely see a role of the digital science, but also how do we bring in the other studies and how do we bring these together and at which level.
And to continue upon what you're saying, Sarah, from my own research, you know that I researched these decision support systems as well. There is also the need for political will because they require a level of trust because the studies are bottom up. So they are made by what we are not used to considering scientists, people in the street. So the leap towards considering people in the streets as scientists, which will contribute data to something which will actually eventually feed into policy, is not very easy. So I don't know whether Mario, possibly, would you like to take this up and possibly discuss, you know, will there be political will to consider this kind of bottom-up locality planning in the sense that we are defining it today?
Yes, and we are trying to do so. And thankfully, I have to say that recently, very recent, but more people who work directly with central government are realizing this and the needs that they will be on board with local and regional authorities to implement such changes. But even to continue on what Sarah was saying, definitely technology and platforms like Carlos mentioned can be used to inform people with developments taking place in their localities, in their areas. And it can also be used, I think it should be used, as a means of communication and consultation with the residents, because it then can provide real-time information, not just on traffic and walkability networks, but also networks such as Antoine mentioned before, going back to slow streets, where the main objective there is to promote walking, cycling, and the use of public transport. So all these together with other educational campaigns to show people that they can avoid unnecessary travel with their private vehicle, I think it helps. So yes, it is something positive, and it is something which we need to take on board and work on it with other government entities, agencies, and so on.
Antoine, I see your hand raised.
Yes, just to continue from this discussion, I think ultimately this ties in a lot to the need to empower ultimately the residents, and as I see it, and as I think the LCA sees it, because we've discussed this amply, there's maybe three strands to this. There is giving people knowledge, right? So and trying to make that knowledge accessible, and this is why we are working on these even documents, dealing with different subject matters that we wish people to be able to gain the knowledge on the subject matter. There's the issue of data, which is critical. I mean, we are still operating in a policy realm that does not have enough data. And this data, yes, can be done in a bottom-up manner, but I would latch something onto that as well, that we need to exploit more and more data from, let's say, service providers. Why don't we have companies that are providing shared transportation opportunities or e-scooters or whatever? Why don't we oblige them to share their data? Why don't we have proper data on parking? As I said in the beginning, I mean, there's a whole, you cannot look at open space and open space management and the experience of open space without thinking about parking management. It's critical. It goes hand in hand. And we lack a lot of data about that. And maybe the third strand of empowerment is in line with what Steve was saying, is the idea of experimentation, the idea of testing, what we call tactical urbanism, ultimately, right? So having this temporary setup, which is reversible, which can be tried out, tested. If it works, it's taken forward. Maybe it becomes more permanent. If it doesn't, then it's easily reversible. And this was one of the strong points that we really wish to emphasize in Slow Streets, to have a number of initiatives that could be tried and tested, by putting temporary cones. If to rethink the street, or if you wanted to define an area better, to literally just put a can of spray, you know, something which can be removed easily, and to see if it works or otherwise. So I think, you know, knowledge, data, and the ability to experiment and to test, I think they all contribute to this empowerment that we need to reinforce, basically.
Yes, yes, and I'm sure Carlos has something to say about that from your research. Carlos, how do you feel that this is tying in with your findings, what Antoine has been saying about?
Yes. Well, before I forget, one thing that Sarah said that is quite important, I think, is the fact that we can use different data and different approaches that complement each other, and this is very important. So obviously, walkability needs objective assessments and traditional surveys and questionnaires and so on, but also they need to be complemented by more subjective and more qualitative research and studies as well. And then also another important point with the data is that obviously citizen science, as any other research approach, has bias, and you need to tackle them, and you need to be aware of them. That's very important. So for example, in my research, you need to be careful with the representativeness of the data, and this is a very important part of my research. So obviously you need to see how representative your participants are for the whole population. And also one criticism that this citizen science approach usually has is that people tend to use participatory research to complain. And what I found from my research is that it's not necessarily the case. In my research, I have slightly more negative experiences than positive, but almost the same. And if you categorize them by different types of experiences, you see that obviously for safety, there are more unsafe experiences than safe, but for pleasantness, there are more positive experiences about vibrancy, street vibrancy, and so on. So
yeah, what do you think, Steve? I know you had your hand raised about what was being said in relation to empowering the community and the challenges that go with that.
What I was going to say is, I think before empowering the community, we must empower ourselves as decision makers, people in local councils, people in public office, politicians in general. Sometimes I'm given the impression that the most people that resist the changes we wish to see are actually the people that can bring the change. So, for example, in the beginning of this year, we started another initiative in Zammit, which we call Zammit, which basically every first Sunday of the month, we close just for 4 hours the carriageway from Zammit to Rabat for traffic, and we open it for cyclists. And every time we do it, we're getting over 150 to 300 people that come to cycle, including small kids of 4 or 5 years old, people even from Gozo that come to cycle. And they're all coming because they are thirsty for this space that is free from cars, from traffic, where they can cycle without the dangers that we live every day. And the greatest resistance I had at first is how to convince the authorities to give us the chance as a local council to do this, to try it out, and when it works, to continue doing it. So sometimes I think the biggest challenge is people in the position to decide. And I think that there isn't enough knowledge on urban planning. I know that the Association of Local Councils in the past few months have offered training opportunities for local councillors, for mayors, to become informed on a number of different themes, not only mobility and open spaces, but the attendance is somewhat poor, and most do not even attend. So that's where I think we need to focus more.
So I tend to agree with my work as well, with local councils and our experience at Dawra Madwarna, we do feel that it is important that the local councils engage with whatever the NGOs would like to achieve, because otherwise it is not really bottom-up planning and it has stands no chance of ever succeeding. So that is, yes, a very much essential element. Sarah?
Yes, I actually wanted to build on what Steve was saying on this idea of empowering also sort of not just the community, but actually local councils, actually the local councils. So like you were saying, through our experience and our work with Dawra Madwarna, when we're working with local councils, you have maybe ones where, okay, you need to increase the knowledge, but there are many local councils who do want to try and do something. And we were hearing this in the last webinar we had, that these kind of initiatives take time, they take resources, they take funding, and this is something which is limited when it comes to local councils. And a lot of the time, the funding which we have available is funding for, let's say, capital projects, actual projects. And you need to sort of, already be at that stage of showing the project you want to do. And I think it's, I just want to maybe stress the importance of having more funds related to these kind of processes, these kind of city building processes, where you're building expertise. Steve, you're saying maybe, I think these kind of events which are organized to maybe build knowledge, which are obviously important, but there's also building knowledge through experience, through experiencing space. And this is this kind of capacity building. So maybe we can focus more funds towards these kinds of processes and these kind of experiences to have this empowerment through these different ways. But obviously, even local councils need guidance in this sense to go through these steps and on how this can work.
Yes, in fact, I wanted to ask.
If Wendy and Sarah, if you don't have the knowledge how to implement something that you want to see change, Antoine mentioned tactical urbanism. If the execution isn't good, it's better not to do anything than to do it badly, because then the reaction will be worse. If you want to pedestrianize a square for an evening, and you do not implement traffic management, and the consequence of that, you have traffic chaos in the streets around, that's obviously going to get residents to speak against what you're trying to achieve and not in favor of it. So it's very important that the implementation is done right immediately. And that can be difficult at times.
If I may, that's why we felt the need as an association. In fact, we are in the process, as Antoine said earlier, to publish these 24 different publications for the regional and local councils to serve as the guidelines for several different sections which fall under the 4 pillars I mentioned before. I definitely agree totally with what Steve is saying, and that's why you felt the need to publish these guidelines, especially where, as regards to walkability, the use of the infrastructures where they should be installed and where not, the clean air, especially in our core village cores, sustainable architecture, urban development, green public procurement. There are quite a few. So these will definitely help the local councils and assist them to implement these projects and such changes.
What I wanted to ask you as well, Mario, is what do you think are the key skills that are needed on the ground at local council level to start implementing such projects? And maybe Steve here, you can as a local councillor yourself pitch in as well.
I think definitely communication skills and even CRM, because unfortunately, and this goes beyond what we're discussing here, the both political parties are more interested in numbers rather than quality. And this is where we have to start. We have to, we should manage to find candidates who are able to make this change, who are willing to work in this field. But unfortunately, as I said, the main problem is, and Steve will definitely agree with what I'm saying, is that both political parties most of the time are more interested in the number of candidates rather than the quality of these candidates. So communication skills, CRM, managerial skills, and the right attitude. Personally, I think they are the main four elements which are very important if one really wants to be involved in local government.
Yes, and that ties very much in with the bottom up, with the empowerment. With giving people not only the framework within which to work, but even the skills to use that framework.
Yes, because if I give an example without mentioning names. In one particular locality, when we tried to implement some initiatives from slow streets, the first thing the mayor said was, if I try to implement these, I will never get elected ever again. So that was his main, that's what he was worrying about, that he won't be elected next time around. So the mentality has to change. We have to find the right attitude. So that's why I'm saying that.
And I really think it is a mentality. From some research which Sarah and I carried out together with a colleague, Therese Bayada, we found that people do want cleaner streets, more walkable streets. And here maybe I can bring in Carlos with the characteristics that you mentioned for walkability, and maybe we can start off another branch of the discussion around what we should focus on in terms of locality-based planning, specifically, so literally characteristics that we should focus on moving forward.
Yeah, well, the waste collection is an important issue, as you all know. Yeah, one of the things that came out from the research is that there are specific determinants which are relevant for many different experiences. So, and the rubbish bags are one of them. If you see these graphs where I show different determinants linked to negative experiences, rubbish bags are linked to unsafe because they are temporary barriers, but also uncomfortable and unpleasant walks. So obviously, there are certain determinants, there are certain characteristics of the public space that should be prioritized, or if the local councils have limited resources, they might try to look for this type of determinants. On the other hand, there are also determinants which are linked to positive experiences, and since we're talking about open and green spaces, urban trees is one of them that came up from the research, because trees are linked to safe experiences. Obviously, trees create a green buffer between the pavement and the road, and there is research saying that cars tend to slow down when they are trees. Obviously, it's more comfortable, especially in summer, because they provide shade, which is very important nowadays. And obviously, it's a pleasant. It has a pleasant impact. So yeah, these kind of bottom-up approaches can help to identify specific elements which can make a huge difference. Yeah.
And this is the constituent speaking. So this is people who are voters, and therefore focusing on these specific issues will really hit the nail on the head. Mario, I see your hand raised.
Yes, because what Carlos is saying is 100% correct. In fact, when we put forward our proposals regarding the waste management plan, we proposed collection points within the localities to avoid having our pavements occupied and obstructed for long hours during the day. And this brings me to something else. If I'm not mistaken, in October, free public transport will be introduced to all ages, to all residents. But I don't understand how we pretend people to use public transport when it is practically impossible to walk to the bus shelters from your home, because as Carlos is saying, there is no infrastructure whatsoever for us to encourage people to get out of their homes, walk to the bus shelter and use public transport. So the first thing, definitely, it's not introducing free public transport, but having the right infrastructure for people to use.
That's a very pertinent point. Looking at the link, the entire link, Sarah.
Yes, actually, because you were talking about the right infrastructure, Mario, and one of the things which I did as part of my research was have these focus groups where I presented a case study proposal for a network of open spaces, looking at the different aspects, some typological interventions in streets, in spaces, in car parks, which are supposed to be public spaces but taken over by surface parking, and showing sort of how they could be transformed and the implications that we would need to think of in terms of, say, traffic management or and one of the things which I try to do is not as such limit the capacity in terms of cars, but more try and intervene in terms of the parking, because maybe parking shifted elsewhere and they don't have to be, you know, on the streets or in main spaces. So, and from the discussions which was held with different authorities and different people from academia and stakeholders, this actually issue of parking, and we've seen it in our webinars as well, it always comes up sort of, you know, what do you do with parking? And I think it's one of the first areas which can be intervened upon to try and create this infrastructure, because whenever you have to say, okay, let's have safer pavements, let's have wider pavements, in proper bus shelters, you need to have reallocation of space. And through the comments of people in the research, it did, yes, it came out that sort of having some sort of centralized parking management system where you try to shift and have, you know, better parking management is one of the most crucial aspects. And so I wonder how we can start on, you know, if parking management is one of the areas which sort of, you know, is maybe being tackled in the, you know, or at which level, you know, because obviously it's at a locality level, again, at a regional level, how do we? Mm-hmm. I mean, I would have my views, but I'm also interested to you know, to see what maybe other people or
maybe here we can bring in Rafael Pasqualone has posted a question in the chat, and maybe this can link with what you're saying, Sarah. If not, we'll bring it up in later on in the conversation. So Rafael has said, so insofar as temporary street pedestrianization already occurs during festas and other cultural and sports events, are there any thoughts from the panelists on how we can engage with festa groups and cultural operators, you know, as partners, experienced people, to make this kind of pedestrianization easier, less inconvenient, more accepted, and therefore it becoming part of the culture of how we use our urban spaces? And this can link also to what you're saying on parking, Sarah, and the reallocation of space to prioritize the pedestrian and the user beyond the car user. So who would like to maybe take up Rafael's question?
If I can just clarify one ambiguity. It's not that they are experts at it, because in fact, I think it's quite badly managed often. For example, I take the bus all the time. Whenever there is a festa in the vicinity, the bus is often diverted and there's no signage indicating that. So to be clear, it's not about us getting tips from them. It's rather us, or rather the experts kind of, you know, uplifting and you know, gently coaching them to become more sensitive to usability concerns during these already existing occasions, to piggyback on the popularity of those. Thanks.
Thank you, Rafael. So anyone would like to take this? I know Mario has written on what Sarah was saying. In the coming weeks, we plan to publish our parking documents, which will give ideas on how this could be better managed in our localities. Mario, I know you have to leave us in a few minutes. So anyway, I thank you in advance if you need to leave quickly for your participation. But what about
maybe we can pick up on that, Wendy, in another webinar, and we'll have the opportunity, Mario, to discuss what you are proposing. I think it would be very interesting to showcase what you are suggesting and what you are doing and create more awareness about.
Definitely, yes. It will be a pleasure.
So on the issue of taking sort of precedence for pedestrianization and really seeing what works and what doesn't, and therefore trying to understand how in Malta we could do this on a more permanent basis, are there any thoughts? Or maybe we could.
I can add on to what Rachel wrote. Yes, it's very important as we mentioned about communication. When we came to implement the first temporary pedestrianization in the center of our town, beyond the usual pedestrianization during the festa or Christmas and these religious activities, we made it a point to involve the band clubs, because obviously their physical presence in the piazza makes them important stakeholders. So what we did, we told them to each organize a barbecue, and I think for the first time in my town of Zabuch, we have 3 band clubs, and they organized a barbecue simultaneously together in the piazza, everyone on his side, but it was actually happening together, and that brought everyone together in the sense of community spirit, as Noelle is wrote herself. And then they bring their kids, and while they're eating, the kids are playing around. We covered the permits to close the street. The band clubs earned an extra money, for their fundraising efforts for the feast, and everyone wins, and everyone is happy. So it's very important to involve the stakeholders, and you actually give them ownership of the event, of the initiative. If you're going to impose it on them, they are going to react in the opposite direction that you want them to react. So it's very important that you give the residents, the shops, the band clubs, other volunteer organizations, you give them ownership of the initiative.
Antoine.
Yes, from our discussions with local councils during the Slow Streets project, in fact, we almost always used to get the reaction that, during the festa, we managed to do this. So, why shouldn't it be more permanent, right? It could be that there is a bit of a harder or a longer drive to take. However, people accept to do it when there is the feast around. So why not if we try to do it a bit more permanently? What I also, however, have an experience of then, since right now we are involved as an office in designing a number of public open spaces, is that, when we have discussions with the council and band clubs and so forth, sometimes it is hard to try and take certain design decisions because of the pressure that for the 1 week of festa, the square has to be designed in a certain way. I've had resistance from a lot of band clubs to put in permanent landscaping in piazzas. Because the stage won't fit, or because it affects our route, and so on and so forth. So in fact, in some piazzas that we are currently designing, we are looking at the possibility of having movable planters, okay, and things that can be removable for the for the occasion of the festa. We've had also instances where, for example, we wanted to provide some proper shading because it's used as having, token landscaping just as small shrubs. I mean, if you want seating areas which are, temporal and which can be enjoyed, at different times of the year, then you want to have some decent landscaping. And then the resistance is no, because this is going to be too bulky, or no, because this will impact the view of the band club, and so on and so forth. I mean, obviously, we try to discuss so that we try to get to design solutions which are accepted by everyone. However, sometimes I find mayors who have a bit of a stronger willpower, who say, listen, I'm not going to compromise the design of my square for 1 week a year. There are others then who are a bit less assertive in that sense, and they succumb to, let's say, these pressures, which, however, end up, I feel, compromising somewhat the design potential of a space. So, you know, I mean, there's maybe two sides to the story, in the sense that there is the positive experience and the possibility to, yes, you know, involve and build on that. However, then, you know, when it comes to maybe the more permanent design solutions, sometimes, you know, I encounter these issues. I mean, it's maybe something.
Yes, this is something which we hear about even in our work. No, I'm going to bring in a comment from Noelle de Bono. So thank you, Noelle, for being here. And she says here, could it be the case that the residents of some localities are more susceptible to change because of their social makeup still holds a community relationship, or because they don't have other challenges? So the toolbox available to local councils has to be varied to a profile of realities. And I think here, Noelle, what I'd like to introduce to the discussion or reaffirm is the concept of the tactical and urbanism, the fact that you test an approach to see if it matches the reality of that community. If it doesn't, you change it, you tweak it, you remove it. And if it does, then it gains permanence over time. And I know, Sarah, you do a lot of work in this regard. So maybe you'd like to say something about this.
Well, I mean, really, this is something, two things I wanted to touch upon here. This is this idea of the tactical, which you were just mentioning, Wendy. So actually, we are starting as well, you know, with Dawra Madwarna. We are working, you know, in Senglia to try and work with this idea of tactical urbanism and testing. And one of the things which was mentioned in our last webinar was, and not only we had somebody from Milan speaking, right, on this idea of testing and how did it work in Milan, because it was, yeah, we try it. Of course, there was resistance. We try it. If it doesn't work, it's okay. And one of the things which another panel participant said, you know, maybe locally, we don't have that way of thinking as such, you know, like before Steve, you were saying, you know, if we do something, or even if it's temporary, it's important we get it right, because if we don't get it right, you know, the residents will sort of say, I know, then this isn't a good idea because it didn't work and it had an impact. And maybe sometimes it's okay to say that upfront, listen, we're trying this, it might not work and it might go wrong. And in which case we might try and find another traffic management system next time around to create the pedestrianization, because obviously that is the more difficult part, the changing of space from you know, car space which is used for cars to then space which is used for pedestrians. So maybe we as an approach in Malta, we need to focus a bit more on that in our approach, and saying, okay, yes, this is testing. We don't have all the answers, and maybe we're going to see, and it might go wrong, and that's fine. The other thing, through again the work in Senglia. So as you know, we did our first workshop last July, and we asked the residents, you know, to suggest. We had a suggestion tree where they could hang their suggestions on this artificial tree, which we created, because it wasn't the right temperature to actually plant a tree. So we said, okay, we create something and people can write their ideas. And when we start to look at these ideas as the first step in the process of trying to, you know, the public spaces in Senglia, what we see a lot is the want for greenery and the want for nature and the want for trees, you know. So I wonder whether, so what Noelle is saying about, you know, having needing to respond to what the different communities want. But sometimes maybe in our consultation or participation, what we call as our part of our design process, maybe we're too used to speaking to the obvious stakeholders, or those stakeholders give too much importance. Like obviously this thing of the festa, I mean, it is a strong voice and it does come through. And even, you know, in my previous experience working in transportation, it was always exactly as I'm saying, but maybe we need to bring out the voice of the residents and be their voice, be that stronger voice of actually there could be, you know, there are the residents who do want these things as part of this idea of a more participatory to try and to drive change.
Antoine.
Yes, no, I fully agree with Sarah, and I just want to build a bit on this, in fact. I mean, even the experience of many cities is that, you know, the tactical urbanism is actually undertaken by the residents themselves. So if, you know, the color of an unstructured space is being, place to redefine it and to make it safer and whatnot, then the residents themselves are there, spraying on the ground, even to kind of give them that ownership. I think, I understand fully also Steve's point of view, because if you try something and it fails, then, you might not be able to do it again, and there might be all the good intentions to do it. The issue is that here it's about finding that balance, because okay, yes, you do a traffic management plan, but we all know how resource intensive and how long it takes to do a good traffic management scheme. And therefore, if we have to say, okay, first we have to do this, then, a year or two will pass, and then you lose the momentum. And therefore, the idea of the tactical urbanism is that you experiment and you can understand that, listen, it could fail, or it's failed for this time slot, for example, but maybe it could fail on another day, and that is why we generally study the tactical urbanism. It's not just something which is done randomly, it's something that one would already know. Listen, look, we already know that, let's say, on Sunday, there is less vehicular activity, and therefore let's start this on a Sunday, and then if it works, we do it on a Saturday, and then if it works, we try it, on a weekday, because at this time, because we know again that it is there are lower volumes of vehicles and whatnot, but my experience with local councils is that they struggle a lot to understand what tactical urbanism is and how to actually do it. I had some councils who said, we like your slow C strategies, we're going to implement them all at once, because otherwise we'll confuse people if we start changing things and then we change something else and whatever. There were others who said, no, we need to build it up slowly, and we need to start with the non-controversial ones, like changing color of surfaces and so on and so forth. But we won't do something controversial like traffic management. What we found as a big resistance, of course, was in fact where we were proposing changing direction of vehicular routes. This, of course, to make it more difficult for non-residents to zap through a locality, basically. Okay, so that was the main intention here, not to make life more difficult for residents. And of course, many councillors telling us, listen, no, because when we try to do just one road, we got so much resistance that then we had to change it back, and we ended up not doing it. When you start looking at these possibilities as being part of something bigger as a network, there I think is where you can start changing a bit some mindsets. But ultimately, and this is something that I've discussed even with Sarah and with a number of other people over the past years, I recently mentioned it in a speech that I gave, is that, we can say, this is cultural, there are mindsets, we need to change mindsets and so on and so forth, but this will take ages. We can't expect this to change from one day to another, but infrastructure is something that we can change. And we can change even in the temporal aspect of it, to redefine, say, listen, what if it were different? Because it's true, if people start to experience, then more often than not, they realize what they're missing, and I think we need to emphasize this more in our strategies, because ultimately, and it's the same with policy, because otherwise we won't change. We've been trying to get the local plans to be revised. We all know how that's going. Decades are passing now, and there is it's not in sight. So maybe we need to look at smaller initiatives, even, let's say, from a policy point of view. So I think that is a direction we should consider.
Yes, considering it a work in progress and a learning process rather than something fixed. I'd like to bring in Brian, one of our participants, who would like to say a few words about a project that he's involved in. Brian, would you like to join us?
Hey, good evening.
Good evening.
To start with, thank you. I wasn't aware of this effort at all. It's really interesting to hear you all. Hi, Steve. Hi, Antoine. The others are strangers. But anyway, we've recently just started an Erasmus project, and obviously the first thing I would do is go through the literature, and I'm very aware of a lot of the work that has been done already, and it's fascinating to see some of you actually here. So Green Evolve basically is looking at two very specific items here. and that is trying to help raise awareness or at least capacity in terms of being in stakeholder meetings, okay, and actually citizen engagement. Specifically, also trying to bring them up to scratch with what their expectations should be on green city elements. Schnifem, green city elements is a very broad subject. In fact, you even in this discussion, you're talking about a lot of different things all together that need to come miraculously somehow at the local council level. It's not easy. I've brushed a lot with green public procurement. I've brushed immensely with energy poverty and the potential impact the whole social urban can have on these people. We're also looking at tremendous projections for climate change, urban quality, energy poverty, vulnerable people, all these groupings. I don't think anyone is really looking at the bigger picture or connecting the dots, if you like. So anyway, in this project, that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to show people what their expectations are and how those impact on green city urban elements, okay? Obviously, the politician is always missing in these groupings, unfortunately. So I'm not sure how we can actually bring it in to such a local level. Pero I would like to make a remark, even because of the academic interests I have as well, and that is items like place attachment, connectedness, and they are not necessarily so urban. There is a big mix, but we could also hone in. There are ways of doing it to try and identify heat maps, sort of places of higher attachment, which we're prioritizing. Pero again, nixtieq infakkarkom li l-Konsilli wkoll they also have Natura 2000 parks right next to them. Some of them have 2, 3. U li nista' ngħidilkom anke mix-xogħol akademiku at that level. The disconnect is incredible. Ġifieri anke the local councils, they actually have Natura 2000 areas. I mean, not fantastic ones, and I've also shown empirically that these can be prioritized. There are areas that are of higher attachment, yet we are not even able to ameliorate those. You know what I mean? Our local councils are a bit macro in their own sense. So we could also start talking about the broader semi-urban, which involves Natura 2000. Parks għaddej għar-rasu, very good active players that are now even reaching out into the urban greening. Pero I can tell you that because I meet them, these people are not very well versed on citizen engagement and neither in the theory of urban greening. Okay, they're just tasked to turn up at valleys and rip out all the alien invasives to everyone's shock and awe. Yeah, we would have been waiting for that to happen for decades, but we have to deal with the umbrage on site and agro. But anyway, hemm ħafna affarijiet li nistgħu nagħmlu, even basics, even just basic information that works are going to start to some effect. Mux people are asking the meat guy who has his own version of it. But anyway, so I would like to touch base with you independently at some point, if you don't mind, because it's fascinating to find a grouping. Thank you.
Yes, well, thank you very much, Brian. I mean, I think at this juncture, it's good to mention that as Dawra Madwarna, we are always looking to expand our network. So we are very happy that people attend these webinars and use them as a tool really to get to know us and what we do. And therefore, please do get in touch. And by participating in our activities, this is the way that we love recruiting people to the network, because it shows passion and it shows interest in the subject. So please do get in touch, and we will too. Now that we know each other slightly. So yes, let us. I want to focus on a couple of things that you said, Brian. First of all, is knowing the context that you are working with. So if you are intervening in valleys and so on, just knowing not only the context of maybe the species, but even knowing the social context that you are working with. And then you mentioned, so Steve, maybe you can pick up on that. And then Carlos, maybe you could pick up on the fact that Brian mentioned the concept of heat maps. So analyzing data to understand where are those hotspots where you really should be intervening in. So we're nearing the end of the webinar, but I think these two factors are really very important. So, Steve, I don't know if you have something to say on this kind of knowledge-based approach in looking at really first analyzing, researching, and then intervening, rather than saying, okay, this is an invasive species, for example, let's go in. And this translates even to urban spaces.
Well, to be honest, I think there's a lot of research out there that's already available. And I think in general, we already know what needs to be done. I've been hearing about this stuff since I was a kid in primary school. Today I'm 27. I've seen very little change on the ground. And we've been bombarded constantly about the needs to take care of the environment, of use alternative transport, plant trees, and all this stuff, which to some point you almost become numb to it. You expect results and results do not come. And when you lose the attention of people who are curious to learn more, it's very hard to win them back. And I think the country is passing through that phase. You've had the time window of COVID, I believe, was a window of great opportunities and change, where people were becoming more aware of their surroundings, more of their need to take care of their health, to go out and exercise. And very little change after that followed. And I think those 2 years that we lost during COVID and now will translate in many more years in the future that it will take to bring the change that we want to see. Antoine mentioned traffic management plans. If you have a council that wants to do a traffic management plan for the sake of doing a traffic management plan where cars are the priority, that traffic management plan will probably fail, because we are leaving from a point where our localities are already infested with cars. So if I want to implement a zebra crossing and all the space in the street has been given to cars, it's obvious that if I want to implement that zebra crossing, I have to take away 2 parking boxes. I argue with those that would oppose is that those parking boxes should have never been there, because the zebra crossing should have been implemented when the street was built years ago. But it's very hard to explain to residents how things should be, because when you give something, even what you are giving isn't what should be the right decision, take it away from them. And that's how people, unfortunately, in general view parking, view the right to drive, the right in inverted commas, and all that sort. So it's sometimes it can be very frustrating to implement this change. I had the main road in Zammit. We followed the desire lines of pedestrians, where obviously most people would cross at the junctions, and we introduced zebra crossings where before they were non-existent. Obviously, there was some resistance from people that were telling us that we were losing parking spaces, but what in reality we were doing was a simple road diet in which we made the street safer for all road users. But obviously, we had the will to go ahead despite the short-term resistance. Today, you see hundreds of people using these zebra crossings. You see the kids crossing the street without danger. And in general, people can walk more freely. So it's really important that there is the political will to get things done. And unfortunately, I think we haven't yet achieved that political will to get things really moving in the direction we want. What Brian mentioned, that people must speak and be voiceful about these issues, obviously helps a lot. When I have people sending emails to the local council telling us, thank you for pedestrianizing the square or for allowing my kids to ride the bicycle, that gives us a lot of brownie points, that other councillors and mayors that maybe are not aware yet of the benefits become aware themselves. And when they see people, backing them, which would then translate into votes in elections, because at the end of the day, we are elected officials, and without the votes of people, we cannot carry out or continue carrying out this change. That can make a big difference.
And in fact, what you're saying, Steve, very much echoes what Noel has written in the chat. Different forces from different directions have to come together at the same time to be able to push forward more forcefully. So top down and bottom up. I know I mentioned you before, Carlos, but I think what Rafael has to say might tie in with this discussion, and then I'll bring in the issue of decision support systems later. Rafael.
Yeah, this is a little bit echoing what I was saying before, but basically, yeah, it's this idea that although we may not recognize it as such, the festas are, I think, a real opportunity for, we talk about having people from different walks of life involved and kind of politicians involved. The festas are an already existing opportunity for intervention, I think. And I'm just curious whether anyone has either directly attempted or knows of people who have attempted to steer the logistics of the festas with respect to usability and pedestrianization and waste management in a way that takes advantage as their potential to serve as kind of pilot projects almost, because the idea was voiced that if we make a big fuss about testing out a tactical urbanism approach and it doesn't work, well then it looks bad. But this happens every weekend in Malta, but it's called the festa, right? So I'm just, this idea of using the festa almost as a Trojan horse to start to improve some of these things, I think that could potentially have some promise. I haven't tried it, but I'm curious about whether anyone knows of anyone who has tried to make improvements in how things work from within the festa or in partnership with them.
But that's an interesting research strand to take up. Currently, I am carrying out some research on the spatial impact of the festa, and it's strange that space is not really considered as a functional indicator within the organizers of the festa. It's taken as a given, as an obvious, as an obvious almost. I want to bring in Carlos and then Sarah. So, Carlos, what are your thoughts on this concept of prioritization?
Yeah, well, first of all, very interesting project, Brian. And from my research, I also see that people identify natural determinants, accessibility, and views from natural landscapes as very important for positive experiences. What he was saying about heat maps has to do with the spatial analysis, which is very important in this kind of approaches, to identify places or groups and then prioritize initiatives. So, and once again, we go back to data, to the need of data to support and to justify future initiatives, future research or planning. So obviously it's very important to have the data, and once you have the data, you need to analyze it and see where you can start. And bottom-up approaches help to do so when you don't have official data, which is in many cases is the case of Malta, where you cannot find official data, and then you can start an initiative to create such data.
And often these are complementary. So the official data, the data you gather through the NSO,
and once you raise awareness about the lack of data and the need of data, then official data will eventually come.
Yeah.
But sometimes you need to start from bottom-up approaches.
Yes, because the people are very good at identifying gaps in that sense. When we ask people to vision, when we ask people to speak about their spaces, it's very easy for them to, just tell you, yes, this is missing, so on. And the challenge normally is to tell us, yes, but what would you like to see? And this is the leap forward. I would like to close off this webinar on time, so I'm going to ask each of our panelists here for some final comments, please. And I take this opportunity even to thank everyone who was here. So we begin, as we mean to continue, maybe Sarah, you would like to start the round of closing comments.
Okay, yes, I'll say a closing comment, but it's also in relation to what Steve was talking about and what Brian mentioned about the maybe, well, lack of political presence. But I would like to maybe, I mean, I get what he was saying, obviously, in the sense that we don't have the top-down political presence, maybe, but we purposefully wanted to have the Local Council Association and the local council here, because I think that is a local political presence in a sense. And the way we are seeing it sort of as Dawra Madwarna, and also through our research initiatives, is the need to actually tap into what local councils are doing, because we are seeing a stronger will for change at local council level. This is what we need to, let's say, I think, support and empower, by what we were saying before. So I think it's important to have this conversation with people at local council level to understand what the needs are and what is happening, and these kind of projects which are actually taking place. So Steve was mentioning, you know, main streets of Zerbouj, the Piazza Pedonali in Hamrun. There is a small street which has now become, you know, a kind of the chicane kind of street for traffic calming, with trees in between the parking spaces, which in itself is a challenge, we know, to introduce these kind of elements into our street designs. And what we want to do as Dawra Madwarna is showcase these initiatives. So this is another, besides these webinars, what we do on our Facebook and on our website. We document and we sort of bring about awareness about these kind of interventions, to show that actually, even though and I appreciate, obviously, Steve, that your efforts, you know, and it's change is hard, and like you were saying, when people then are very appreciative of this, that's what we want to do as well, show that these are actually the good interventions and create more awareness, so that there is a stronger voice about, yes, change is happening, you know, at a small pace, but it is happening, and the demand, I think, is increasing. So yeah, that's what I want to do, for us to focus on what the local councils are doing. We're muted, Wendy.
Sorry, my internet copped out on me for a while there. So thank you, Sarah. Antoine, maybe some final comments, please.
Yeah, I maybe just want to make the one comment at this point, which you know, I start to see through the experience of Slow Streets, and now working with a number of local councils for some more tangible projects, is that, you know, I mean, we cannot underestimate the technical input, right, that we are able to give. Because we are able to question a what-if scenario, you know. I almost, you know, I almost wanted to, while speaking to local councils and getting to know what they needed and so forth, I almost wanted to take, you know, a very detached, in a sense, you know, and objective approach, where I wouldn't have too much information from the council, so that I could question it, you know. I had a lot of reactions to a lot of proposals in Slow Streets, where, you know, mayors themselves would tell me, you know, we never realized that the street was over-dimensioned. We take it so much for granted, you know, that actually it could be less wide, you know, we could have more pedestrian space. It's true, it could actually work, you know. And I think sometimes, because obviously there's the pressure and residents and everyone wants parking, I think, yes, I mean, you definitely need to do a whole webinar on parking, because it is, unfortunately, in our country, it is, I think, at the root of many problems. You know, and there is this failure to see the bigger picture. I mean, it's true that changing a one-way street into, you know, I mean, changing direction of a one-way street, making a two-way street into one-way street is going to create disgruntlement. But when you see that that change is contributing to a wider purpose of actually deterring unnecessary traffic, which therefore will make it safer and more easily accessible to walk to the street, then it's looking at it in another perspective, you know, and maybe we kind of need to give a bit of more of that, you know, that people who have the knowledge and who have the initiative to do it, then should be, in a sense, more forceful in a way, you know, and almost people should be facilitated to do that. Because otherwise, of course, it is great. And I'm not saying we should not involve, of course, we should involve everyone. And we should definitely see what local councils need, because local councils ultimately know what, you know, the residents' needs are and so on and so forth. But we need to break away from sometimes very localized and parochial almost, you know, problems to try and really make a difference. And sometimes you just need the outsider who tells you, you know what, it cannot be like this, just try it out. And then there is the experience, and then things can change, you know. So we need to have a bit of both, because ultimately, I think if we don't do that, you know, and we just want to try and almost, you know, please everyone, I mean, we end up maybe not even making any change whatsoever. So I just wanted to put that aspect, I think, which is also important across in my mind.
Yeah, thank you very much. It is indeed important. Steve, final comment from you.
Well, I think I've said most that I wanted to say, but as Antoine mentioned before, there's a like very mixed reaction amongst local councils. There are obviously some that are more eager, some are more conservative, and each locality has its different circumstances in face to the problems, which I think are quite national. The problems are the same everywhere, but how you tackle them or how they affect your locality is different. Okay, but I think as local councils, we need a lot more support from the authorities. There are a lot of things which I would consider very basic, which are missing or lacking or very vague, where authorities come into force. Let's not forget that local councils have very few powers, if any. So even if we want to paint boxes, the parking boxes in the street, you need to get approval from Transport Malta. So you're always at the stake, at the mercy of higher powers. And there were instances where you do requests for certain, you know, things that should make the road safer. And instead of receiving the support from Transport Malta or Infrastructure Malta, amongst others, you receive resistance rather than support. And that's very disheartening, you know, because most of the times they put the excuse local councils must request for a pedestrian crossing or for some other intervention in the street. And in our case, there were instances where we requested and our requests, rather than facilitated, are turned down. And that's very disheartening because we're trying to change, and instead of changing, we are going backwards.
Yes, and the amount of energy you put into it is exponential.
Antoine is a professional here. I am not a professional. As a local councillor, I earn €170 a month. So requesting Transport Malta to include pedestrian crossings or Infrastructure Malta to make the street safer. I'm technically going out of my way to do that, and it takes time to send emails, to do meetings. It's very easy to lose the motivation, you know, because then when you see people that are paid, especially in public office, that should be trained to have policies and laws that facilitate this stuff doing the opposite, it can be very disheartening.
We should be pulling the same rope, no, towards
the negative, but that's the reality. I can paint it in a positive way. I try to be optimist, and I have faith that things can get better. They should get better. They have to get better, and I'll try to work as much as possible in the little capacity I have to go into that direction, like everyone here is. But that's the reality on the ground.
That's the thing. We have to balance our expectations with reality. It's a way of moving forward, ultimately. But I want to take this opportunity for thanking you for what you do in the Bush. I'm from the Bush myself, and I think increasingly I meet people who are proud to be from the Bush because it's seen as a forward-thinking locality, and I know that's through your work and through your passion. So thank you. Carlos, would you like to say a final comment before we close off?
Okay. Well, I could end just saying from from the walkability part, I would like to say that walkability has a very strong holistic and context-specific nature. And from the holistic part, that requires the collaboration between community researchers and policymakers. All parts needs to be aware that they can greatly contribute, but also benefit from collaborations. And from the context-specific nature, I would say that it requires the need to give voice to everyday pedestrians, not only to let professionals know what they think and share very important insights, but also to give them the opportunity to co-create, to helping the co-creation of research, of initiatives, and eventually policies. That would be...
Yes, I think that rounds it up nicely. And a comment has come in from Sarah. I'll just very quickly go through it. And she says, like, whilst change is hard, I believe that if we harness the desire of Maltese people to simply see change in their own street, this can happen. So looking at really, thank you, Sarah, for bringing it all together. In a sense, this webinar was about locality-based planning. And therefore, yes, even as Dawra Madwarna, we really do believe that it starts bottom up. It starts with the tiny interventions, and then it blossoms into something that can be replicated. So to close off, thank you everyone for being here. This webinar will be is recorded. So we will be analyzing the proceeds, and we'll be taking this forward into even the next webinars. Please monitor our Facebook page so that you are aware of when we are having our next events and our next initiatives. And if you would like to participate more actively, maybe by taking part in a webinar or in an event, please do get in touch. So we'll be switching off the recording now, and I take the opportunity to thank you all for your presence here this evening.